The wind howled across the Wyoming plains like a wounded animal, pushing grit into every corner of Samuel McKenna's ranch. The land stretched endless and empty, nothing but dry grass and dust devils dancing like restless spirits. At 43, Samuel stood on his porch with the stiffness of a man shaped by hardship. His skin was weathered by sun, his jaw tight, his heart heavier than the wide sky above him. 3 winters had passed since consumption took Martha, leaving him with nothing but cattle, creaking boards, and silence so thick had pressed on his chest. The ranch hands came and went, but at sundown Samuel faced nothing but the mournful call of coyotes. Nights were the worst. He often sat at the kitchen table, staring at Martha's apron still hanging on its hook, the air so still it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. That loneliness was what finally drove him to write a letter. He wasn't a man of fanciful notions, but practicality had won over pride. A matrimonial agency in Chicago promised discretion and suitable wives for frontier men. Samuel's hand had been firm but plain as he wrote his requirements: slim, obedient, hard-working, between 25 and 35. A woman who wouldn't complain when the water dried up or when winter storms locked them in for weeks. He pictured her in his mind, quiet, slight of build, like Martha, neat hands, soft voice, someone who'd fit into the small, empty spaces Martha left behind. He told himself it wasn't about love. Love was a luxury. This was survival. 2 months, the agency said 2 months until his new wife would arrive. That thought carried him through endless repairs. The crooked door hinge, the squeaking bed frame, the pantry overrun with mice. Every hammer strike was a reminder that change was coming. He even tried to imagine laughter echoing again in the house. But, in truth, it was Martha's laughter that haunted him, not the laughter of someone new. When the day finally came, Samuel put on his best shirt, starched stiff enough to rub his neck raw. He arrived early at Cedar Ridge Station, pacing so much the station master asked if he was ill. His palms sweated as passengers filed off the train. Traveling salesmen, ranch hands, a minister clutching his Bible. His heart sank as the flow of people slowed. Had she changed her mind? Had the agency tricked him? Then she appeared. The last passenger stepping carefully down the narrow stairs, clutching a worn valvalise. Samuel's breath caught, and not in the way he had hoped. The woman was nothing like what he'd pictured, not a slim, delicate flower. She was full-figured, strong in her frame, her traveling dress straining at the seams. Her face was handsome rather than dainty, her storm-gray eyes steady under dark curls spilling from her bonnet. She looked like someone who had weathered storms of her own and come through stronger. "Mr. McKenna," she said, her voice carrying a hint of Irish lilt but sharp with Boston steel. "Miss O'Brien," he managed, removing his hat. He took her, it was heavier than it looked, and led her to the waiting wagon. She climbed aboard without waiting for his hand, settling her skirts with practiced ease. The buckboard groaned under their weight, and Samuel found himself wondering if the axles would last the 10-min ride home. The silence between them was thick. Finally, Margaret O'Brien spoke. "The agency said you were a widower. How long? 3 years this winter?" "I'm sorry for your loss." He nodded, his jaw tight. He wanted to ask her questions, but couldn't find words that didn't sound wrong. She seemed to sense it. "The agency told me you had expectations," she said calmly. He flushed. He had been very clear in his letters. Slim, obedient, hard-working. "I'm 28, she continued, meeting his glance with pride. "And I came west because I wanted a life different from what Boston had waiting. That's the truth, Mr. McKenna. I'm not slim, and I won't apologize for it." Her words struck harder than the wind. Samuel kept his eyes on the rutted road, gripping the reins as if they might steady the storm rising in his chest. He could already imagine Tom Bradley laughing. Sam McKenna, picky as ever, finally got a bride, and she was nothing like he ordered. When they reached the ranch, Rex, his old dog, bounded out, barking at the newcomer. Margaret bent down and held out her hand, and the dog wagged his tail as though he'd found a new friend. Samuel felt a strange twist in his chest at the sound of her soft voice greeting the animal. It was the same gentle tone Martha used to use. Inside, Margaret took in the sparse furnishings and bachelor's mess without comment. She touched the apron, still hanging by the stove, but let it be. When she moved into the kitchen, rolling up her sleeves and asking where the pans were, Samuel felt a surge of unease. This stranger was already filling his house with her presence, her scent, her movements. "I'll check the herd," he muttered, backing toward the door. She didn't turn, only nodded. "I'll have supper ready." Outside, Samuel breathed deep, the cool air sharp in his lungs. What had he done? He'd wanted a quiet, slim bride to slip into Martha's shadow. Instead, he had a woman with a voice like steel and hands strong enough to chop wood. A woman who looked like she could wrestle a calf if she had to. His neighbors would laugh. The whole town would whisper. Rancher wanted a slim bride, got a curvy one instead. He saddled his horse and rode out into the fading light as if he could escape the reality waiting in his house. Behind him, smoke rose from the chimney. The first time in months, the place had shown such signs of life. But Samuel didn't look back. He couldn't. Something in that cold, silent house was already changing, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. The first week felt like living with a storm that refused to break. Every morning, Samuel woke in the barn to the sound of Margaret's heavy footsteps inside the house. By the time he came in, coffee was brewed and breakfast was on the table. Not beans and cold bread like he usually managed, but eggs, bacon, biscuits, real meals. They ate in silence, the scrape of forks on plates louder than any conversation. Margaret worked harder than Samuel had expected. She scrubbed years of bachelor dust from the corners, hauled buckets of water from the well without pause, kneaded dough with strong, steady hands. She mended, cooked, and cleaned with a determination that made Samuel both admire and resent her. He caught himself staring more than once, watching her arms as they chopped wood, her skirts brushing against the ground as she carried water. She was efficient, capable, everything useful, but not what he had ordered. One evening, thinking she couldn't hear, he muttered under his breath, "I asked for a wife, not a workhorse." Her hands froze over the mending in her lap. She looked at him, her gray eyes sharp as flint. "Would you rather a delicate flower who faints at the sight of blood? Because that won't keep your cattle alive or your house standing." Her words stung because they rang true. He turned away, cheeks hot, but her voice followed him out the door. "Maybe you should decide what you really want, Samuel McKenna." In town, the whispers started. At the general store, Mrs. Henderson looked Margaret up and down with a smirk. "So, you're Samuel's bride. Sturdy woman, aren't you? You'll need to be, out at that ranch." Margaret smiled sweetly, her words cutting like a blade. "Indeed, I've always believed a woman should be built for the life she's meant to lead. Wouldn't you agree, Mrs. Henderson?" The storekeeper's mouth snapped shut. Samuel almost smiled, but swallowed it, hating that he felt grateful. At the feed store, Jack Morris clapped him on the shoulder. "Heard you got yourself a bride, Sam. Bet she keeps you well fed, eh?" His eyes lingered on Margaret's curves. Samuel's fists clenched, but before he could speak, Margaret answered for herself. "The best meals a man ever had," she said firmly, her chin high. "A hard-working husband deserves proper feeding." The men laughed awkwardly, but the sting of their mockery had been turned aside. Once again, Samuel was left with an uncomfortable mix of pride and shame. By Saturday night, the tension reached its peak. Margaret had drawn a bath and hung a blanket across the kitchen for privacy. Samuel tried not to think about her behind it, tried not to imagine water splashing over skin, but when she emerged, cheeks pink, hair curling damply around her face, his breath caught. She wore a nightgown that clung softly to her frame. Without a word, he fled to the barn like a spooked colt. Sunday brought the preacher, Reverend Palmer, and, with him, the wedding. Margaret wore a blue wool dress that fit her like it was made for her. Her hair was pinned neatly, showing the proud line of her jaw. She looked handsome, striking, a woman carved out of strength and survival. The ceremony was short. Tom Bradley came as witness, smirking the whole time. When Samuel slipped Martha's old ring on Margaret's finger, something in his chest twisted, but there was no other choice. "You may kiss your bride," Reverend Palmer said. Samuel leaned in, intending only a brush on her cheek, but Margaret turned and their lips met. Her mouth was warm, soft, surprising. He pulled back quickly, unsettled by the strange flutter in his chest. "Well, Sam," Tom said afterward, grinning. "Congratulations. May your marriage bed be sturdy." Margaret flushed, but she held her head high. The lunch she'd prepared was simple but hearty. Samuel watched her hands tremble slightly as she poured coffee, and for the first time he wondered what this was costing her. That night, the question they'd both avoided could not wait. Samuel stood awkwardly in the parlor. You'll want to move your things into the bedroom," he said, "if that's what you want." Her voice was even, but her eyes searched his. "It's what's expected. We're married now." Something flickered in her face. Fear, hurt, hope, but it was gone before he could name it. "Yes," she said softly, "we're married." Later, lying in the narrow bed, the old frame groaned under their combined weight. Samuel clung to the edge, half afraid the mattress would collapse beneath them. Margaret lay stiffly, her breathing shallow, as if she were holding herself apart from him. "I know I'm not what you wanted," she whispered in the darkness. The words cut him to the bone. He thought about denying it, about offering comfort, but his pride wouldn't let him. "We'll make do," he said finally. Her sigh filled the silence, and she turned away. The bed squeaked in protest, but it held, much like the uneasy beginning of their marriage, strong enough to last, though nothing like he had imagined. But the West had its own way of testing men's choices, and Samuel would soon learn that making do was not enough. Wait, before we move on, what do you think about the story so far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm really curious to know. The storm came without warning. One moment, the Wyoming sky was clear. The next, it turned a sickly yellow, and wind screamed across the plains. Samuel had been out checking fences when dust swallowed the horizon. He forced his horse toward the ranch, grit stinging his eyes. Through the blur, he saw Margaret outside the barn, struggling with the cows. "Get inside," he shouted, but the wind tore the words away. She didn't run. Instead, she pointed at the chicken coop where the door had blown open, hens scattering like leaves. Before he could stop her, she dashed into the storm. Together, they fought the chaos, shoving birds back inside, wrestling the barn doors shut, stuffing sacks to keep sand from pouring in. When they finally stumbled into the house, coughing and bruised, Samuel noticed blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. He reached out before he could think. "You are hurt." "It's nothing," she said, though her eyes softened when he pressed a damp cloth to her skin. For hours they sat together, the storm battering the walls, coffee cooling in their cups. Samuel found himself asking questions he had avoided. "Why did you come west, Margaret?" Her hands tightened around the mug. "My parents died. My brother inherited everything. His wife made it clear I was a burden, too old, too substantial for suitors. So I answered the ad." Samuel looked at her in the firelight, her face strong, her shoulders broad, her presence filling the room. "And you ended up with a fool who asked for the opposite of you." "At least you're honest about it," she said quietly. That honesty grew between them in the following days. When Samuel injured his knee-ixing fence posts, Margaret became his strength, hauling water, tending stock, even riding the range to check the herd. He protested, but she silenced him with a look. "Would you rather lose cattle, Samuel, or swallow your pride?" He had no answer. Neighbors began to notice, too. Children adored her. Women sought her advice, and even the men who once snickered at her size grew quiet when they saw her wield an axe or charm a skittish horse. Samuel tried to ignore the stirrings in his chest, but one moonless night everything changed. The sound of horses woke him. Rustlers, 4 men circling the barn. He reached for his rifle, but Margaret was already loading the shotgun. "They'll take the stallions," she whispered. "Stay inside." He ordered like hell. She shot back. Out in the yard, torches lit the night. Jake Morrison, a known thief, called out, "Come out easy, McKenna, and nobody gets hurt." Before Samuel could respond, Margaret strode forward, shotgun steady. "That's far enough, boys. First man touches that barn door will answer to me." The rustlers laughed, but her aim didn't waver. When Morrison fired, the bullet tore Samuel's shoulder. He fell, pain blinding him. Margaret roared his name and stood over him like a shield. Her shot blasted Morrison's hat clean off. "You want these horses?" she shouted. "Come through me." Her voice, her fury, her accuracy broke their courage. Muttering curses, the men fled into the night. Only when silence returned did Margaret drop beside Samuel, her hands trembling as she bound his wound. "You could have died," she whispered. "So could you," he rasped. Her eyes glistened. "I'm not what you wanted, Samuel, but I'm here. I'll fight for this ranch for you." He caught her hand, rough and strong. "I see that now. I was a fool to want less." Quote, "From that night on, something shifted. When winter came early and snow trapped them for days, they grew closer still. They worked side by side, laughed at mistakes, shared stories by the fire. One evening, as the wind howled outside, Samuel cup-puffed her face and kissed her, not out of duty, but out of truth. She kissed him back, and the walls between them finally crumbled. Months later, after wine and laughter one spring night, the old bed gave way with a tremendous crack. Boards split, the mattress pitched, and they tumbled together in helpless laughter. Rancher wanted slim bride, Samuel wheezed. Got a curvy one who broke his bed instead. Margaret buried her face in his shoulder, laughing until tears came. We'll never live it down. Let them talk, Samuel said, pulling her close. Let them all know I got the best damn wife a man could ask for. Years passed, and the ranch thrived. Children's laughter filled the rooms. Neighbors sought Margaret's wisdom and Samuel's steady hand. Together, they built a life strong enough to weather any storm. He had asked for a slim, obedient wife. What he got was Margaret, strong, brave, full of life, a woman who broke his bed and rebuilt his world. And Samuel thanked God every day that the West had given him not what he wanted, but exactly what he needed. The oak bed they built together never broke, but their laughter, their love, and their story echoed across the plains. A reminder that sometimes the best things in life come when expectations are shattered and hearts finally learn to see the truth. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and write in the comments which moment stood out to you the most.